Israeli government pushes on with divisive legal overhaul. From Punjab News Express. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu coalition advanced 3 bills which are key parts of its proposed judicial overhaul plans that have divided Israel's society over the past 2 years, or 2 months. The bills were brought up for voting in the early morning hours of Tuesday after a fierce debate. Lawmakers with Netanyahu's new ultra-religious and ultra-nationalist government voted in favor of a bill that would allow the Knesset parliament to cancel Supreme Court rulings with a simple majority vote. The bill was adopted by a 62 to 52 vote in a first non-binding reading, meaning it still needs to pass 2 more rounds of voting before becoming a law, Xinhua news agency reported. The Knesset also voted in a first reading in favor of a law that would cancel the Supreme Court's authority to declare a prime minister unfit for office for any reason other than physical or mental impairments. The third bill, which was also approved in the first reading, calls for the legislation of 4 unpermitted settlements in the occupied West Bank. The 4, Homesh, Sanur, Ganim, and Kadim, were evacuated in 2005 as part of Israel's disengagement plan, in which it withdrew its forces from the Gaza Strip. The ruling coalition says the proposed overhaul is needed in order to curb the overly activist Supreme Court, but critics fear that it will give unrestrained power to Netanyahu, who's facing a criminal trial over corruption charges, and his government. The proposed plans have created an uproar with weekly massive demonstrations across the nation. And from Arab News, Ramallah, Israeli authorities' use of the term Judea and Samaria government in official documents to describe the West Bank has raised Palestinians' concerns of a ploy to silently annex settlements in the area. Ismail Mansour, a Palestinian expert on Israeli affairs, told Arab News that Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich is implementing plans to annex the West Bank, bypassing bureaucratic, administrative, and political obstacles and ignoring external pressure as he seeks to subject the area to Israeli law. Mansour said that annexing the West Bank to Israel might not affect the lives of 3 million Palestinians, but would certainly affect the Palestinian Authority politically and legally. With the PA calling for a 2-state solution, annexation will make the West Bank non-negotiable and subject to Israeli law, he said. More than 650,000 Israeli settlers live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while Area C constitutes about 60% of the West Bank. Sources say that Israeli military authorities have used Judea and Samaria Brigade, a military for the West Bank, a military term for the West Bank, for the past 55 years. Palestinian drivers say that tickets issued by Israeli traffic police when they travel between Palestinian cities bear the logo of Judea and Samaria Governorate, while the signs of some roads and places have been changed to carry the new name. Palestinian political analyst Ghassan al-Khatib told Arab News that Smotrich is taking small steps toward formal annexation in the face of international pressure. Smotrich's measures, which aim to annex Area C to Israel, should alarm the PA, he added. Israeli affairs expert Majdi Halabi told Arab News that Smotrich is trying to improve the living conditions of settlers in the West Bank in bringing them in line with those of Israeli citizens in Tel Aviv. Halabi added that Smotrich's assumption of responsibility for the civil administration gives him powers related to Israeli settlers in the West Bank. The only problem with this is if you are not living in Israel, you're not an Israeli citizen. You should not be voting, and the government should not be protecting you and taking care. I mean, it makes no sense that people that live outside of Israel are influencing its politics. The Israeli civil administration has significantly increased its dealing with Palestinian civilian affairs without going through the PA, while dealing with the settlers takes place through Israeli government ministries.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
The Israeli civil administration has significantly increased its dealings with Palestinians' civilian affairs without going through the Palestinian Authority, while dealing with the settlers takes place through Israeli government ministries. Why isn't the Palestinian Authority dealing with Israeli civilian issues? See how preposterous that sounds? Zionist journalist Diana Ben Shimon of Israel Today said that Smotrich wants to transfer the powers of the Zionist occupying forces civil administration regarding settlers in the West Bank to Zionist ministries because he doesn't believe that the Zionists are occupying the territory, but constantly repeats, "We're not guests, we are the owners of the land." Ben Shimon said that Smotrich wants government ministries to control the management of Zionist settlements, of Zionist occupations in the West Bank, and occupiers he considers Zionist citizens. He also looks forward to annexing the settlements to Israel in Area C. Zionist political analyst Yoni Ben Menachem believes that Smotrich is trying to equate the rights of occupiers in the West Bank with those of other occupying citizens. Smotrich wants to solve all settler problems in the West Bank, legitimizing occupation outposts and providing them with services such as water and electricity, and increasing Zionist influence in the West Bank, which will increase the level of political support for him among the occupiers, said Ben Menachem. Nevertheless, the Zionist parliament, the Knesset, approved in its first reading on Tuesday a bill to abolish the separation withdrawal law, or what is known as disengagement from settlements in the northern West Bank. According to the bill, a ban will be lifted on occupiers entering and staying in the evacuated northern West Bank settlement areas, as well as recently evacuated outposts including Homesh between Nablus and Jenin. Palestinians inside Israel and its West Bank are preparing to commemorate Land Day on March 30th with protests against the Zionist occupation. From Middle East Eye, Israel Netanyahu move a step closer with judicial coup bill in parliament. Israel's parliament on Tuesday moved a step closer to passing a bill that would allow politicians to overturn high court judgments with a simple majority as well as appoint judges. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's planned legislation to overhaul the country's judiciary has been described as a judicial coup. In an overnight session that stretched into the early morning, the Knesset also approved several other pieces of legislation, including legislation that would prevent the country's attorney general from declaring Netanyahu unfit for office. The prime minister would only be declared unfit for office due to physical or mental inability, and then only by the prime minister himself or by the vote of 3/4 of cabinet members. The parliament also passed a piece of legislation that would expand settlements in the West Bank. In a further potential blow to the judiciary, the Israeli parliament also voted for a bill that would require a consensus of 12 out of 15 judges to strike down legislation that was ruled unconstitutional. The same bill would allow parliament to override the Supreme Court with a simple majority while demanding a supermajority for the highest court to do the same. As it stands, only a simple majority is needed in the Supreme Court to strike down laws passed by the Zionist parliament. Each of the bills requires additional votes before being enshrined into law. The fact that these bills are making their way through parliament against a backdrop of historic protests in Israel against Netanyahu's attempts to weaken the judiciary has not dampened the government's agenda. The bill overhauling the judiciary also has a retrospective clause allowing parliament to overrule previous judgments by the court, whereas another bill would repeal section of the 2005 disengagement law, which resulted in Israeli settlers evacuating 4 settlements in 2005, and which could now see those settlements being reoccupied. Israeli political crisis. Israel is in the midst of a political crisis that's pitted Netanyahu's far-right government against the country's civil society, academic, and business elite, and former government ministers and military figures. In an open letter on Sunday, more than 250 U.S. business leaders and politicians warned that Israel judicial reforms will make it increasingly difficult to defend the country internationally. Many leaders in the business community will feel compelled to reevaluate their reliance on Israel as a strategic destination for investment, sourcing talent, building engineering centers, and maintaining intellectual property. Business leaders warned in their open letter. Netanyahu is currently on trial for corruption, and the reforms could enable him to evade conviction or see his case dismissed. Since being indicted in 2019, Netanyahu has railed publicly against the justice system, calling it biased against him. Israel's been engulfed in political turmoil for over 2 months, as tens of thousands of people continue to take to the streets in mass protest. Demonstrators want the government to scrap the controversial judicial overhaul plan that they say threatens checks and balances in the country. The demonstrators have been growing, drawing in supporters from various professions, including the military, the justice system, and the high-tech sector. In light of the proposed reforms, the Zionist currency has declined, and the leading U.S. financial institute, J.P. Morgan, has warned of a growing risk of investing in the country. I'm from China.org. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition advanced on Tuesday 3 bills which are the key part of the proposed judicial overhaul plans that have divided Israel's society over the past 2 months. The bills were brought up for voting in the early morning hours after a fierce debate. Lawmakers with Netanyahu's new ultra-religious and ultra-nationalist government voted in favor of a bill that would allow the Knesset parliament to cancel Supreme Court rulings with a simple majority vote. The bill was adopted by a 62-52 vote in first non-binding reading, meaning it still needs to pass 2 more rounds of voting before becoming a law. The Knesset also voted in first reading in favor of a law that would cancel the Supreme Court's authority to declare a prime minister unfit for office for any reason other than physical or mental impairments. And the third bill, which was also approved in the first reading, calls for the legalization of 4 unpermitted settlements in the occupied West Bank. Homesh, Sanur, Ganim, and Khadim were evacuated in 2005 as part of Israel's disengagement plan, in which it withdrew its forces from the Gaza Strip. The ruling coalition says that the proposed overhaul is needed in order to curb the overly active Supreme Court. But critics fear that it will give unrestrained power to Netanyahu, who's facing a criminal trial over corruption charges, and his government. I mean, that's one of the, we read that in a few articles there. That's a huge understatement that it could either curb the overly activist Supreme Court, or it could give Netanyahu unrestrained power. I mean, the extreme scenarios of that are probably what will happen. And from Memo, Israel advances bill enabling return to illegal settlements evacuated in 2015. Israel's far-right occupation government advanced a bill yesterday that would enable settlers to return to areas of the West Bank evacuated in 2005 as part of the disengagement law enacted by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. According to Haaretz, the bill headed by Likud Knesset member Yuli Edelstein passed by a majority of 40 in favor, with 17 MKs opposing it. The introductory text to the amendment states there is no longer any justification to prevent Israelis from entering and staying in the evacuated territory in northern Samaria, so-called Samaria, and therefore it's proposed to state that these sanctions of the disengagement will no longer apply to the evacuated territory. The bill would repeal the clauses of the disengagement law that ban Israelis from living in the region where the 4 illegal settlements of Nomesh, Ganim, Kadem, and Sanur previously stood in the northern occupied West Bank. Edelstein and Israeli National Missions Minister Orit Struk sponsored the measure following the request of the head of the Settlements Council in the occupied West Bank, Yossi Dagan, who expressed his pleasure at the government's decision. This is the start of correcting a historical injustice. I expect the law to be completely repealed. This is a struggle we've been waging for 18 years, and we finally see the light at the end of the tunnel, said Dagan last month, after the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, passed a preliminary reading of the bill last month with 62 MKs in favor and 36 against. All of Israel's settlements and settlers are illegal under international law. In 2005, the Prime Minister Ariel Sharon enacted a law requiring unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and the northern West Bank and the removal of 25 illegal settlements in the 2 areas. 21 settlements in Gaza have already been removed and 8,000 settlers have been evacuated. In the occupied West Bank, 4 illegal settlements were evacuated, but the structures in them were maintained in the areas labeled closed military zones.